Please allow me to just give a brief introduction about our speakers. Mr. Richard Lau, the CEO of Dragon Sourcing. Richard is the CEO and co-founder of Dragon Sourcing and has over 30 years of consulting and operational experience. Prior to finding Dragon Sourcing, Richard had worked for a range of blue-chip consultancies, including Booz Allen and Hamilton in London and Accenture, and managed large international procurement programs across a variety of industries, including automotive, chemicals, FMCG, electronics, paper and financial services, etc. So welcome, Richard. The floor is yours.
Hi, Daisy. Thank you for this introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. And I hope that people can actually see my screen. Yes, so very briefly about myself. Daisy said I've been in procurement for a long time, in consulting and in industry. In consulting, I was a partner at Booz Allen and a managing partner for sourcing at Accenture. And in industry, I was with Philips, running all of the indirect procurement for them globally. And so basically, I started Dragon Sourcing in 2005, so something like 17, 18 years ago. And I'm not going to spend too much time on Dragon Sourcing, just a couple of minutes. There's a quick video if you want to actually get a bit more information about us. You can go on our website and you will see there is a short introductory video that you can look at, and it will give you, I think, good background information. But basically, we do procurement intelligence. This is like market research type work. Most of what we do is global sourcing to help clients to identify, qualify, and manage suppliers in all of the important emerging markets. We also do procurement outsourcing, outsourcing of IPOs, of buying offices for clients, and hence we can run those offices for them on an ongoing basis. Very briefly in terms of where we operate, so we truly try to cover most of the important supply markets in the emerging markets in red. The red dots is where we source from. So mainly, of course, in Asia, India, China, and Southeast Asia, but also a lot in Eastern Europe, in Turkey, increasingly now in Africa. And then we do a lot of work also in Mexico for the North American market, and sometimes also in South America, Brazil, and Argentina. Who do we work for? Well, we work for a range of clients. We're not specialized in any particular sector. So we work for clients in industrials, in food and beverage, in all different types of consumer goods, in retail, in automotive, in mining, in construction, packaging, chemicals, energy, pharmaceuticals. And then also, even though we don't have many names there, increasingly you can see on the bottom right hand side the e-commerce. There might be many e-commerce people watching today, but we're doing a lot more work now in e-commerce. It's of course a growing segment of the market, particularly with the appearance of what is called e-commerce aggregators. These are companies that are buying out many e-commerce companies and really creating scale in the game. Those types of companies are in need of global sourcing support to provide scale in their procurement. So that's enough said about Dragon Sourcing and about myself. And so the topic for today is to try to give you a few hints, a few good practices for sourcing from China. Many of these hints and practices can be applied, of course, outside of China. It's not limited to China, but a lot of the work we do is in China. And so it's, of course, very relevant to the situation in China. If time permits, at the end of this section, I will take you through a case study to try to illustrate with a concrete example how to apply these types of approaches. But to go through this discussion around best practices, what I've done here is laid out a very simplistic view of the key steps in sourcing. So we've broken it down into 3 phases, what we call an opportunity analysis phase, a second phase, supply selection and contracting, and the last phase around procurement operations. Other people would call it fulfillment of the orders. And so in a very simplistic way, if you want to do sourcing, you first, of course, have to understand your requirements. After that, you've got to identify potential suppliers. Once you've identified them, you've got to try to collect information about them to kind of pre-qualify them and maybe shortlist a reduced list of suppliers that could potentially be attractive for you. So this is like this initial phase, which we call here opportunity analysis. In the second phase, it's about collecting, I would say, more operational information from the supplier that you've shortlisted, through auditing them to verify that all the data that you've collected previously is confirmed by your actual visit to the facility of the supplier. It's of course critical to get samples to see if they can make products that are meeting the client's or your particular requirements. And then if all of those steps are successful, then of course you need to conduct final contract negotiations to see if you can agree terms and conditions in order to finally select the or multiple suppliers that you're going to be working with. And after that, then you go into operational mode where you've got to place orders, and then you've got to, of course, get involved with quality control of those orders, logistics management to ensure a good delivery. So that's kind of the overall simplistic view of how sourcing needs to be conducted. And I'm just going to take you through some of these steps to identify some risks and then explain how to mitigate those risks. So the first step is to understand your requirements. It seems like a fairly simple step, but it's quite frequent that companies want to source products without having a full understanding of the specifications that they're looking to buy, without having a full understanding of the kind of compliance issues that might be associated with maybe importing this product from China into, let's say, North America or into Europe. And so if you start the process with an incomplete data set, then you could be in with some very bad surprises later on in the process, because if you only inform suppliers much later in the process of new requirements which you had forgotten to inform them about at the beginning, well, you might find that some suppliers which you had expected capable of responding to your needs are no longer capable of doing so. So that's my first strong recommendation. Make absolutely sure at the very beginning, when you start sourcing, that you have a full, complete understanding of all of the specifications that are needed and of all of the compliance issues. You know, what certifications might be needed, what regulations do you need to comply with to import this product into the EU, let's say, or into the US before you start. Because otherwise you could be wasting a lot of your time and a lot of the supplies. The second step then, once you've got that initial understanding well laid out, it's to identify potential suppliers. So let's assume you're focusing on China. China is a huge country and it has a lot of suppliers, as we know. And it's really important not to limit yourself to, we know many companies that are just going on Alibaba and trying to find a few suppliers. Of course, it's a way of doing things. But if you do that, there's a low likelihood that you'll be identifying potentially the best supplier for you. So our advice here is to take a bit of time, not to precipitate the process, not to rush it, and to truly try to identify all the potential suppliers for your particular product. Only if you do so can you be sure that you will have involved in your process potentially the best suppliers for your product. So again, take the time, do the analysis, be comprehensive to make sure that you identify everybody. The next step, let me go back here. The next step into the process will be to run what we call an RFI, RFQ process. For those that are not familiar with these terms, it's a request for information, request for quotation. So this is a process whereby you send a template, a document to the suppliers, asking them a lot of information that is of importance to you. So you want to know maybe their size, some financial information, the kind of products they can make, their export experience, what certifications they might have, how they deal with social responsibility, what production capacity. You might have a lot of questions that are important to you in terms of how you want to select companies. And so it's important to create those templates and, of course, send that questionnaire to the suppliers along with the RFQ, the request for quotation. This is a grid where you, of course, provide all of the information about the product you want to source, all of the data you've collected previously, when you were trying to understand your requirements. So all your specifications, your volumes, your destinations of deliveries, your certification requirements, your payment terms, all of this critical information so that suppliers can, of course, look at those requests and respond accordingly. So you have to give them a bit of time to respond. And when you close the RFI, RFQ process, you go to analyze all the responses that you're getting from the suppliers and profile the suppliers, analyze their capabilities and their competitiveness. And on the basis of that, you want to shortlist maybe 4 or 5. Those that appear to be based on the responses they've given you to the questionnaire, and also based, of course, on the quotations they've given you. Those that appear to be potentially the most attractive for you. And then once you've got that short list of maybe 4 or 5 suppliers, then you want to go and audit them, because all of the information you've collected previously has all been collected on a self-declaration basis. This is you asking questions to the supplier and the supplier responding to your questionnaire, but of course, you can't be absolutely sure that they provided you with all of the right information. So our advice is go to the facilities of those 4 or 5 suppliers, go visit their manufacturing facilities, go talk to their management and verify that all of the information that they've given you is confirmed. And you will find, this is one of the major causes of failure in sourcing, is that when you go and visit those suppliers, that quite frequently, many of them will not actually have the right capability that you look. They would have told you something in the questionnaire previously in the RFI. They would have had beautiful websites, but when you actually go and visit the facility, you will immediately realize that they might not be fit for purpose. I have visited hundreds of manufacturing facilities in China, and I can tell you that there are instances where I walk into the factory and in a heartbeat, I know immediately that it will be basically impossible to place an order in that particular factory. Despite the fact that the website looks wonderful, and despite the fact that all of the answers to the RFI were very good. So this is one thing you need to brace yourself for, but don't skip this process step, because again, if you shortcut this and just trust the supplier's responses, again, you could be in with some bad surprises. Don't forget, you know, the sourcing cycle is critical, because once you've selected a supplier, you're going to have to live with that consequence for a long time. You know, you're going to start placing orders, and you want to make sure that those orders are going to be delivered on time, in quantity and in quality. And so our advice is, don't shortcut the sourcing process. Do it comprehensively, objectively, collect all of the necessary facts, because you know, if you don't do that, you might be selecting suppliers which are going to be causing a lot of problems later on in your process. The next step in the process after the auditing, if the audit is good, so let's assume you had 5 suppliers on your shortlist after the opportunity phase, and that after the auditing phase, maybe you're left with 3 suppliers. You might have eliminated 2 from the auditing. Now you want to actually get into product development mode to see if they can actually make a compliant product. And this is probably the single biggest failure. So we observe, at least when we do work for our clients, you know, we have very, very frequently suppliers telling us we can do it, no problem. But when they actually have to make the product, it turns out that they're finding it more difficult than they had anticipated. I'm talking here, of course, of a situation where we're not buying a catalog item from the supplier. Here I'm talking about a situation where we're buying a custom-made product to the client specification. If you're buying from a supplier's catalog, then of course that issue isn't really there. You just have to make sure that the catalog items are in line with your requirements. But if you are, you know, a buyer that is custom designing a product with technical specifications and looking for suppliers to make that particular technical spec, then the ability of the supplier to actually make your specification is probably the single biggest cause of failure. So you have to, again, brace yourself for that. And also the cycle times can be quite long. You know, sometimes molds might be required, which can take several weeks or sometimes a couple of months to build. When the mold has been made, they've got to make the samples. The samples might not be right the first time. And so, you know, here you can brace yourself as well for a process which can be sometimes fairly long. Multiple months can be needed before you get to a final product which is to your satisfaction. And here, particularly in the e-commerce space, you know, we work a lot in e-commerce. I distinguish 2 types of companies in e-commerce. The companies that I call Me Too, and companies that are truly trying to build brands. Me Too companies are companies that are just buying off-the-shelf products from existing catalogs. My feeling is that that is difficult to be a very successful strategy in the long term, because it's tough to differentiate your product on Amazon or whatever platform you're selling it on. But, you know, companies that are building brands, these are companies that are, you know, developing products to their specifications with their packaging and their requirements. And this is where this whole sample development process becomes critical and can take quite some time and much longer than some companies might anticipate. The next step is conducting final negotiations. So we've been through the auditing, we've been through the sample development and testing, and maybe after all that, we might be several weeks or maybe several months after the initial quote that we collected. And what happens quite frequently is that when you get into final contract negotiation, the suppliers are changing their pricing. This can happen for a variety of reasons, maybe because you've changed your specification in the product development cycle. That happens quite frequently. And so, of course, the spec is not the same, and hence the price goes up. But it can also be driven by the fact that raw material prices might have increased. You know, we're in a situation right now with a lot of inflation. And I can tell you, suppliers are increasing their price sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, because raw material prices are increasing. And so that could be a reason for the increase. There could be currency issues as well. You know, you can look at the RMB versus the dollar. That is fluctuating quite frequently and quite highly as well recently. It's quite volatile. That can cause quotations to change. And then also just because the suppliers, they had an initial view of what the cost might be, but once they've been through the actual sample development phase, they understand that this particular manufacturing process might be more complex, and they just revise the price upwards. So this is again a risk that you have in this process. You have to brace yourself with the fact that you could have worked for several weeks, sometimes several months. You think you've got a great supply, you think you had a very competitive price, and what can then happen is that the supplier comes back to you and says, well, sorry, the price is now going to be 15, 25% higher than what I had initially indicated. And then after that, you finally have to make a decision about selecting suppliers. And this is a practice called back leveraging, which we observe very frequently. Now, this depends very much on what kind of company you are, but if you're an e-commerce company, this is not really a topic of concern. But if you're an industrial company that is looking to buy, let's say, from China or from Southeast Asia or from India or any other emerging market, you know, they are currently buying, let's say, from Western Europe. They have suppliers established there. And the whole initiative is about trying to find new suppliers that are lower cost. And let's assume that at the end of the sourcing cycle, after the auditing, after the sample development, after the contract negotiations, the Chinese supplier is 25% cheaper than the European supplier. The temptation for many buyers in Europe and North America is to do what I call here back leveraging, is to go back to their current suppliers in North America or in Western Europe and to tell them, look, we now have an alternative supplier in China. They are 25% cheaper. And unless you reduce your price, we will shift the volume from your company to this new supplier in China. This is called back leveraging. The temptation is, of course, big to do this because very frequently the Western suppliers will move. They might not move completely. They might not go back totally to 25%. But maybe they'll reduce their price by 10% or 15%. And very frequently, the buyers then will say, okay, thank you very much. I'll take the 10% reduction. And therefore, I will achieve my targets for the year. I won't have any risk associated with moving from my existing supplier to a new supplier in China. And that's it. They give up on the Chinese supplier and stay with their incumbents. Short term, I understand the logic, but you know, this is not the way to run your business longer term, because you will, of course, build a reputation in the Chinese market of somebody that is not serious. So you can play this game maybe once, you can play this game maybe twice, but after that, you're not going to get any more responses from your Chinese suppliers. And when your incumbent suppliers will eventually come back to you with price increases, you will have no alternative to basically negotiate those price increases back from your incumbent supplier. So it's very important to take a strategic view, to think about having a diversified supply base, so that if you're a European company, that you want to make sure you have, of course, suppliers in Europe, but that you also have suppliers in Asia, potentially suppliers in North America, but that you diversify your supply base so that you're never at the mercy of a particular region where currency effects could be negative, or transportation costs could have an impact, or raw material prices could have an impact. And you can therefore play different regions and leverage your supply base in different regions to ensure that you remain always competitive. At the end of the sourcing cycle, once you've actually selected a supplier to be your partner, then you move into actual operational mode. You're placing orders to those newly selected suppliers. And of course, it becomes critical to engage in quality control. Having a supplier who can make a good sample is good and important. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can be as reliable in mass production. And so it's critical that at least in the beginning, for the first 6 months or the first 12 months of you placing orders with that supplier, that for every single order that you organize for a third-party quality control to come onto the supplier's premises before the products are loaded on the container, to carry out a thorough professional QC to make sure that in production that the products are in full compliance with your requirements. So those are the key, of course, logistics. I'm not going to say too much about logistics right now, but it's becoming, of course, a key issue with China, as everybody knows. Logistics costs have increased significantly, threefold, fourfold compared to what they were before COVID. So that, of course, has a huge impact on the competitiveness or the potential competitiveness of Chinese suppliers. There are, of course, also, as we know now in China, lockdowns that are also having an impact on the ability of some factories to actually produce and deliver on time. So these are all factors that you need to, of course, take into consideration when you're making decisions about where to source from. I can tell you that a lot of our clients are looking to reduce their dependency on sourcing from China. And then hence are looking for suppliers in Southeast Asia, in India, in Eastern Europe, in Turkey, and Mexico. But I can also tell you that in 95% of the cases, and we do a lot of that kind of work, the Chinese suppliers remain the most competitive, despite the very high transportation costs, despite when we're looking at the US, in many cases, the 25% extra import duties. Despite all that, the Chinese suppliers remain very, very competitive. But you do have to factor those issues in. Costs are rising, and the supply chain is becoming less reliable. So, in summary, just wanted to summarize what I've said. The first key practice is in terms of making sure you have a complete, comprehensive understanding of your requirements, so that you don't launch your sourcing process imperfect information, hence getting quotes from suppliers which will be invalidated later on when you come back to them several months later saying, oops, by the way, I forgot to tell you that we also need to meet this particular requirement. That's the first key issue. Second key issue is supply identification. As I said, cast a wide net. Don't satisfy yourself with superficial searching of suppliers. Don't just go on Alibaba and find 5, 6 suppliers. Try to really identify all your potential suppliers to make sure the best supplier can be identified. Auditing, as I said, it's critical. Once you've collected all of your information from the suppliers through this RFI process and RFQ process, don't just rely on that, because unfortunately, suppliers are not always trustworthy in terms of what information they give you. Go and visit those suppliers, visit the factories, and sometimes you have to be ready to engage in what I call here supply development. It might be the case that the suppliers you visit might not have all of the capabilities you're looking for, but you might have to be engaging in what we call supply development. You might have to work with the supplier or help that supplier to bridge the gap between the capabilities they have and the capabilities that you're looking for to qualify that supplier as a good supplier for your business. Sample testing, so when you get into product development and testing, speed is important. We've had many instances where, we've worked for clients and the samples are being sent to the client and they just sit on it for weeks on end without testing it, often because they need to run the product into their factories. I don't know if let's assume you're buying plastic film, wrapping film to wrap your products. Well, to test the product, the client has to test the product on their production lines. Well, production people at the client's factory are not always very happy to actually have to test new products. And so sometimes it can take weeks and weeks before the product is tested. If you do that, you lose momentum, suppliers get demotivated, and very frequently the program fails. And so it's important to get your internal clients, if you're a procurement department in a large industrial company, make sure you get your production people involved, your quality people involved, your marketing people involved in your initiative in terms of trying to find new suppliers, because you got to get their support, you got to get their help when it comes, for instance, to sample testing, that they will commit to running these new samples in the factory rapidly so that you can go back to the suppliers with your results. Final negotiations and supply selection, no back leveraging. It's bad practice, and it will backfire on you medium to longer term. And then this notion of recognizing the value of having a qualified supplier base. It's important to not give up on suppliers. Like I said, we have situations sometimes when a supplier will increase their quote at the end of the sample development, so that the savings you're getting from maybe your current supply in Western Europe might not be as big as you were hoping. Maybe you had a 25% savings. At the end of the sourcing cycle, you're only up back to 10% savings, or 5% savings, and you say to yourself, oh, well, it's not worth it. It's very often the wrong decision. Like I said before, having a diversified supply base in Europe, in Asia, can strategically be very important. So even if the savings today is only minimal, 5% or 10%, the notion that you can rely on a qualified supplier in China, because maybe in 6 months from now, your European supplier will increase its price, is strategically important. And then the final point here, quality control. Make sure that at least in the beginning, for a new supplier, make sure that you carry out independent third-party quality control on all of the orders that you're placing, all of the production of that particular supplier, and make sure you have a good quality protocol for doing that. But there's some very good QC companies in China that can make that happen. In some cases, I would recommend doing in-process control and pre-shipment. So not just to wait for the end of the production, but to anticipate and to, in the middle of production, go into the factory, do an in-process control to see if it looks like the supplier is on the right track. And then this last point here, trial containers. So don't consider a supplier to be fully qualified before he has delivered maybe 2 or 3 containers that have fully met your requirements. Only then would you consider that supplier to be fully qualified. So that's in summary what I wanted to say. I'm not sure I have time for a case study. If somebody can give me a sign about how I'm doing for time. The case study, this is an example from work done for a client in the area of decorative luminaires. If I recall, I think this was a French client. But just to give you a feel, they wanted us to look at China. Of course, China is critical, but like I said, many companies now are trying to see if they can find alternative suppliers outside of China, and they were particularly interested here, as you can see, in several East European countries. And so we went through the process that I was describing in my previous document, in my previous section. Every step of the process I was describing, step by step, we went through that particular process. Here you can see a timeline for that. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but usually that initial phase, which we've called the opportunity analysis phase, is usually a couple of months to conduct. So the demand analysis, you can see here, getting a good understanding of the requirements. There were different categories of luminaires, a lot of SKUs. You can see 355 items and the spend of 5.4 million euros. And you can see the different types of, well, these are brand names, so it's not going to speak to you, but these are different types of luminaires. And here you can see pictures of the kind of products we were talking about in terms of the luminaires they were looking to source. So here were 7 of them, and another few others that you can see the kind of products that we're talking. So here, listing what kind of capabilities the suppliers needed to have for each of these different types of products in terms of technology in-house, sheet forming and bending and rolling, metal spinning, tube working, polishing, LED technology assembly. So, we are working with the client to have a good understanding of what they insist the supplier must have in terms of technologies in-house, so that they are absolutely sure that the supplier can master all of the key process steps and come up and deliver a quality product. So this is an important step in the process to make sure you understand what it is you're looking for when you're looking for suppliers. And so we go through our process of building the long list, going through an initial phone screening process, going through the RFI, RFQ process, and then you can see the result of that. So we started with a list of 209 suppliers, and then going through the various steps, we eventually got 25 responses to the RFI, RFQ. And you can see it was heavily biased towards China. Of the 25 responses, 21 came from China, 4 came from Eastern Europe. And when we analyzed the responses and recommended suppliers for auditing, you can see that only Chinese suppliers in the end were recommended for audit. It's a good example that I was just talking about before. Many clients are looking for alternatives to China when we look at Eastern Europe, but also when we look at Southeast Asia, or when we look at India, or when we look at Mexico. In many, many, many cases, the Chinese suppliers, the picture that you see here, comes back similarly. Not necessarily the same numbers, but in terms of which country is coming out on top, it's very, very frequent that China is still coming back on top. So here, just to give you a feel for where the suppliers might be located. So we truly source all around China. We don't limit ourselves to a particular region. And you can see here in Eastern Europe where the suppliers were located. We come up with the reasons why we rejected suppliers. I'm not going to go into the details of that. We don't have the time for that. We go into the reasons why the supplier did not respond to the RFI, RFQ, and then we do the scoring of the suppliers. So remember, we asked them a lot of questions in the RFI, and so we use the responses to those questions to score them on a scale of 0 to 100. You can see some suppliers here scoring, the top supplier scoring 84. It's a very good score. And you can see some suppliers, particularly in Eastern Europe there, the Polish supplier was a 24 score, was an 8 score, sorry. But anyway, you can see the scoring from the Chinese suppliers, from the Romanian suppliers, and from the Polish suppliers. This becomes, of course, an important score, important information to keep in mind when selecting suppliers for sampling and auditing. We do the same thing with the quotation. So you can see a lot of data, no need to go into the details, but we have the quotes from every supplier. We have the RFI score on the top. We usually have the price paid by the supplier, the client right now in yellow. We've removed that because it's a bit confidential. But anyway, we lay out all of the quotations, and then we do an analysis, the competitiveness of the quotation in terms of savings that can be achieved. So you can see supplier 1 can achieve significant savings. We look at how many items he's quoted. We look at the RFI score. And so we take all of these criteria, and then on the basis of that, we make recommendations about which suppliers to include into the next step of the process. So I think we recommended, I forget, maybe 12 or 13, I forget. This is just a page with 5 suppliers and with some rationale as to why we are recommending those suppliers. And the next step after this is to go and audit those suppliers to verify, of course, that all of the information we've received from them is indeed correct. So that's it. That's a very, very rapid illustration of how to apply that kind of a process on a concrete example. So I'm going to pause there, and then if there are any questions, now I guess it's the time to go to the Q&A.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard, for the very, very detailed and useful presentation. And I hope the audience today can learn something and help you with your sourcing needs. So let's move on to the Q&A session. And we've been receiving quite a lot of questions for you, Richard. First one from Malaysia. How is the current situation in China in terms of supporting procurement sustainability in the global market?
Well, let's put it this way. There are challenges with China. As I said, inflationary pressures. So costs are rising. That's a certainty. Transportation, as I said before, the transportation costs have risen dramatically. That's for sure. There are, of course, like I said, COVID-related issues right now. Hopefully those will disappear in the not too distant future, but it's having an impact, of course, on supply chain reliability. Let's not hide it as well. There are political tensions between China and the US, and also between China and the EU. So that's also playing a role, where, Western companies are looking to what we call decouple because they feel like they might be too dependent. So all these things are happening, which is making the sourcing from China more challenging than it used to be maybe 5 years ago. But like I said, and using that example, despite all that, China remains, I would say, an extremely attractive supply market for a lot of categories.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. And I hope that we answer the questions from our audience from Malaysia. So maybe let me just have a question from Europe, from Czech Republic. The question is, what's the best way to ensure reliability of my supplier? Where to look for reference, review, feedback from previous customers?
Yeah, well, definitely these are important questions to raise. So, when you go through what I was calling this RFI process, the request for information, so this is your opportunity to ask a lot of questions to your supplier. And of course, asking for client references is a critical question to ask. Asking for the export experience into, let's say, the EU market, if you're a Czech company, is a critical question to ask. So yes, these are of course very important, but not only. I mean, when you ask questions, you've got to ask questions about their quality systems, about the production capacity, about their technology, about their social responsibility. Of course, social responsibility is a key issue in Europe, of course. So you have to, of course, ask many different questions. And then, of course, I strongly advise to go and visit, like I said before, because, okay, asking a question is kind of simple, but you've got to reassure yourself that the suppliers have provided you with correct information. So my strong advice is to go and audit those suppliers and verify that all of the information is correct.
Thank you, Richard. And maybe let me just pick on a question from our live audience today. So one question is, could you give more details about the sampling process?
Well, I mean, the sampling process can either be very simple or rather complex. Like I said, you've got two situations. One, if you're buying an off-the-shelf catalog item from the supplier, then you've got to pick the item from the supplier's catalog that's of interest. And then the supplier will ship it to you, and then you've got to test that product to see if it meets your requirements. So that's reasonably simple. If you are looking to buy a custom-made product, so you've got your own specifications, you've got your own designs, your own brand, and you want the supplier to make a product to those specifications. So it's not something that he's got already, that he's produced previously. The process will be more lengthy. You might want to include more than one supplier in that process because you can't be sure that he will succeed. Of course, that will depend on the cost of developing those samples. Like I said before, if molds are needed, molds can be quite expensive. So getting more than one supplier involved can be costly. So under that scenario, if you only want to select one, then I very strongly recommend auditing the supplier before. That you go and visit the factory, you go and visit the mold making facility, that you talk to management, that you really reassure yourselves that they truly have the capability, because once you start with making molds, it's going to be costly, it's going to be lengthy, and you want to maximize the likelihood that that will be successful down the road. So these are the two extreme situations. You can have a very simple situation where you're buying off-the-shelf items from a catalog. So nothing very wrong can happen other than the supplier product is not what you're looking for when you test it. To the other extreme, where you've got a highly customized product made to your technical specifications, where the supplier needs to develop new molds that can be expensive and lengthy to build. And there you've got to be extremely careful and very thorough before you select that supplier to make that kind of an investment.
Thank you, Richard. And I think I've received quite a few questions from Bulgaria, Hong Kong, Colombia, on a very similar subject, is how to reduce transport cost. As we all know, the price has gone up excessively at the moment.
Yeah, I have the same question, Daisy.
So
look, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that question. You've got to, of course, like any other sourcing process, buying transportation is like buying anything else. So you, of course, have to, like any other service or any other product, you've got to conduct a professional sourcing process to identify the best freight forwarding companies. Different companies have different expertise and different competitiveness depending on where they deliver to. So you've got some very good companies for North America, good companies for Scandinavia, you've got good companies for Germany. So, you will have differences in pricing. And so you have to do a comprehensive and professional job in selecting your freight forwarding company. But, that might give you a variability of 5–10%, between the more competitive and the less competitive. But it's not going to offset the fact that those prices have increased by 3 times compared to what it was a couple of years ago. So against that, there's nothing much that can be done. But what can be done is to still make sure that you're getting the most competitive rates by doing a professional sourcing process, exactly the same approach, the one I was describing here. Whether you're buying a service, whether you're buying a product, you want to go through the same process to select the best supplier.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you for sharing your advice on these universal questions that from everyone else. And now we have another question that, hi, Richard, do you have any advice to efficiently source new supplies from Asia without having the capacity to travel through facilities and exhibitions there?
Well, if you can't physically go to either go to trade shows, or then the only option I can think of is through using an agent. You must. I'm not saying that because we are an agent, but if you want to source from Asia and you don't have a local team on the ground, and you can't travel there, and you can't go to trade shows, then of course you can try Alibaba. I mean, some people do it just on Alibaba. Okay. If you want to buy simple products, you can probably make that work. But like I said, if you are looking to buy more sophisticated branded products that are custom made to your specifications, I would not advise doing it that way. Then I would advise really working with a professional local agent that can help you.
And now let's move to the next questions. Do most RFI and RFQ get a response when requested?
Is the question whether suppliers will respond to the RFI, RFQ?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, not all of them respond, of course. So, the statistics of response rates vary greatly by product. Some products, the response rates are quite high because there's lots of suppliers and the product is quite simple. In other cases, the product is a lot more complex and the response rate is much lower. So that is what drives the response rate in terms of who will respond and who will not respond. And then in terms of what questions they do respond to, there again, there's a lot of variability. Some suppliers consider some questions to be confidential, particularly, we were mentioning before the need to ask for client references. It's, of course, very useful information to have, but suppliers are not always willing to provide that information. They say it's confidential and they just decline to respond. So sometimes it's a sign that they don't have good references and they use it as an excuse. That can be the case. In some cases, they truly don't feel comfortable providing that information, and so they just won't do it. So, yeah, so there's a lot of variability by product category and a lot of variability in terms of what they will respond to from category to category and from supplier to supplier.
Okay, thank you. And Richard, I think we have about 4 minutes left. So maybe let me just share with the last question from the audience today. How to make sure that supplier fulfills orders per specification after cash down payment? Well,
that comes back to this QC issue. I know that the payment terms in China, and not only in China, by the way, in most emerging markets, particularly at the beginning of a new relationship with a new supplier, it's typically 30% down payment and then 70% against a copy of the bill of lading. So there is, of course, risk in that because once you've paid 30%, there's, of course, the risk of losing that money if the supplier either is not honest. That can, of course, happen. There are situations and stories of people buying on Alibaba and selling 30%, and then the supplier disappears. But, of course, there are also issues of the supplier being very honest, but basically having a hard time meeting the quality. So that's why it's really critical to conduct quality control. Usually the 30% is enough to cover the material cost of the supplier. So the supplier's interest is to succeed, of course. And he wants to, of course, make his product, get it quality controlled positively, and then get the 70% paid. But so to reduce the risk, of course, you have to conduct these QCs before the product is loaded on the container. And if the QC is a fail, And like I said, you as a third party, there's lots of QC companies in China. You can go to Asia Inspection, you can go to Bureau Veritas, you can go to SGS, you can go to Intertek. There's many companies doing it. They tend to be very conservative. So the slightest issue that they find, they will fail the QC. You can then review the QC report and make a decision yourself as to whether you want to release the goods or not. But if you do the QC, there's a very low risk the QC would come back with a positive QC, and then when you receive the goods, that the goods are no good. I don't think I've ever seen that happen. I mean, it's extremely rare. The QC is done properly. They will detect the issues. The container will not be shipped out, and the supplier will have to rework the product until a new QC is conducted again, until the QC is a pass.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I know that I've said that that will be the last question, but since I'm based in the UK, so I'm a bit biased. So may I just squeeze in one last question from the UK audience, is how to verify the supplier's finance credit score?
Yeah, no, it's very complicated, particularly in China, but particularly in the whole of Asia. Many suppliers are known for having, dual accounting. They have two different sets of books. What we do sometimes on behalf of large clients, very large clients, sometimes want to conduct financial audits of suppliers. So we will go in and ask and request for all of the accounting books, and we will conduct a very thorough, detailed financial review and audit. Okay, that's pretty expensive. Very rare that companies will go through such a process. There's some credit agencies, Dun & Bradstreet and others, that can provide some level of comfort in terms of the credit rating of suppliers. That can be done at a much lower cost. But then it comes back also a lot to the sourcing process. Again, if you conduct a very professional sourcing process, following the practices I was describing, and you include in that the auditing of the suppliers and the product development and the contract negotiations, you develop a good sense that this is a serious supplier, that they have very serious clients, that they have significant turnover potentially. So through that process, you can reassure yourself to a 99% degree of certainty that supplier is in all likelihood a solid supplier. So that's the best I could respond to that. A good sourcing process. You can use things like credit agencies to come up with some evaluation of the credit worthiness, and like I said, you can do very deep financial audits, but that's pretty rare and pretty costly.
Cool. Thank you, Richard, for sharing your insight. So thank you everyone who joined us today. I know some is from Asia, so it's quite late in the evening now, and also from Europe, it's almost lunchtime. So thank you everyone, and thank you Richard again for sharing such a useful insight. And anyone who wish to learn more and know more about our TTC services and also the ISS International Sourcing Show that we've mentioned, please scan and follow the barcode on the screen now. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.